The blue and red lights painted the rain-slicked streets as Officer Dean Mercer tapped his partner on the shoulder. "Pull over. That silver sedan. The driver's acting strange." Officer Tanner Wilcox squinted through the windshield wipers. "You sure? Dispatch hasn't flagged anything." "Just do it," Mercer insisted, his jaw tight. "Something's not right." Wilcox shrugged and flipped on the siren. The sedan hesitated before drifting to the curb, tires splashing through puddles. Mercer was out of the patrol car before they'd fully stopped, hand already resting on his holster. "Stay in the car, sir," Mercer called, approaching with measured steps. The driver male, mid-30s, white dress shirt, soaked with sweat despite the autumn chill, kept his hands visible but wouldn't meet Mercer's eyes. "License and registration," Mercer demanded, shining his flashlight through the window. As the beam swept across the back seat, he noticed a smear of something dark on the upholstery. "Is there a problem, officer?" The man's voice cracked. "Step out of the vehicle, please." When the man complied, Mercer noticed his trembling hands and the peculiar metallic smell that clung to him. "Sir, I'm going to need to search your vehicle." "You can't do that without probable cause," Mercer finished. "Which I have. Now stand with my partner." The man's shoulders slumped as Wilcox approached. Mercer circled to the trunk and paused, a cold certainty settling in his gut. "Open it," he ordered. When the man didn't move, Mercer took the keys from his limp hand. The trunk latch clicked, and he raised the lid. The woman's body was folded impossibly small, limbs contorted at unnatural angles. Her eyes, still open, reflected the patrol car's flashing lights. "Jesus Christ," Wilcox whispered. Mercer turned to the driver, who had collapsed to his knees on the wet asphalt. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," the man sobbed. "You don't understand." But Officer Dean Mercer thought he understood perfectly. He had no idea how wrong he was. 3 weeks earlier, Dean Mercer's alarm blared at 4:45 a.m., as it had every morning for the past 12 years. He silenced it before it could wake Elaine, though she'd long ago learned to sleep through the electronic scream that began his days. The bathroom mirror revealed the same face as yesterday, strong jaw now softened slightly with age, blue eyes that had seen too much, and sandy blonde hair cropped military short. At 38, he still maintained the disciplined physique that had carried him through the police academy and 14 years on the force. Dean had been born to wear the uniform. His father had worn it. His grandfather, too. 3 generations of Mercers serving Oak Ridge, moving up through the ranks, protecting and serving. He dressed quietly in the dark, his fingers easily finding each button, each fold, each crease that needed straightening. The weight of his badge was familiar, comforting. The weight of his service weapon, less so, though he'd carried it for years. Before leaving, he bent to kiss Elaine's forehead. She stirred but didn't wake. They'd grown distant lately, ships passing in their own home. His hours weren't helping back on patrol after the internal affairs investigation had concluded. A temporary demotion, they'd called it. A chance to reconnect with the community. Dean knew what it really was. Punishment. A slap on the wrist that felt more like a punch to the gut. The drive to the station was quiet at this hour. Dean preferred it that way. No distractions, just the dark road and his thoughts. Lately, those thoughts had grown darker too. "Morning, Mercer." Captain Reynolds nodded as Dean passed his office. The greeting was perfunctory, none of the warmth from before the incident. "Captain." Dean returned the nod, keeping his face neutral. The locker room was nearly empty, just a few officers from the night shift changing to go home. Their conversations died as he entered. No one quite met his eyes. Dean changed methodically, ignoring the silence. When the door swung open again, he glanced up to see Tanner Wilcox, his newly assigned partner. Young, eager, and unburdened by the weight Dean carried. Fresh out of the academy with ideas about changing the world. "Officer Mercer," Wilcox said with a smile too bright for 5:30 a.m. "Ready for another day of making the world a safer place?" Dean grunted in response. The kid's enthusiasm grated on him, but he couldn't deny that Wilcox was a good cop. Thorough, observant, just naive. "Briefing in 5, Dean said, closing his locker. The morning briefing was routine updates on ongoing investigations, bolos for suspects in recent crimes, and patrol assignments. Dean and Wilcox drew the North District again. The rougher part of town, another unspoken punishment. "You want to drive today?" Wilcox asked as they headed for their patrol car. "No, you take it." The first few hours passed uneventfully. A shoplifting call at a convenience store, a minor fender bender in a parking lot, a wellness check on an elderly resident whose daughter couldn't reach her by phone. She was fine, just forgot to charge her cell. It was during their lunch break that the call came through a domestic disturbance at the Parkview Apartments, Unit 307. "That's the third time this month," Wilcox noted, as they pulled away from the diner, their sandwiches half-eaten. Dean didn't respond. He knew the address well, too well. "Dispatch, this is Car 17 responding," Wilcox said into the radio. "ETA 4 minutes." The Parkview was a faded 3-story complex on the edge of the North District. Once middle-class housing, now sliding steadily into disrepair. Unit 307 belonged to the Conrads, Michael and Sarah. Dean had responded to their first domestic call 8 months ago, Sarah with a split lip, insisting she'd fallen. Michael, overly polite, explaining that his wife was clumsy when she drinks. The second call came a month later, a broken arm that time. "I slipped in the shower," Sarah had claimed, while Michael nodded sympathetically behind her. 5 more calls after that. Each time, Sarah refused to press charges. Each time, Dean had to walk away, the law tying his hands. "Remember, we follow protocol," Dean told Wilcox as they climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. "No assumptions, no accusations." Wilcox nodded, but Dean could see the tension in the younger officer's jaw. He'd read the case file. He knew what they were walking into. The shouting was audible from the stairwell. A man's voice, then the crash of something breaking. Dean quickened his pace, Wilcox at his heels. Dean pounded on the door of 307. "Police! Open up!" The shouting stopped. Footsteps approached, and the door swung open to reveal Michael Conrad, breathing heavily, a forced smile on his face. "Officers, there's no problem here. Just a little disagreement." "We received a call about a disturbance," Dean said evenly. "Mind if we come in and make sure everything's okay?" Michael's smile tightened. "Actually, I do mind. My wife and I are having a private conversation." "Sir, we need to verify that everyone in the residence is safe," Wilcox interjected. "My wife is fine," Michael insisted, blocking the doorway. From inside the apartment came a woman's voice, shaky but clear. "It's okay, Michael. Let them in." Michael's face darkened, but he stepped aside. The apartment was small, sparsely furnished but neat. Sarah Conrad sat on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. No visible injuries this time, but Dean noticed how she held herself rigid, protective. "Mrs. Conrad," Dean nodded. "Everything all right here?" "Yes, Officer Mercer." Sarah avoided his gaze. "Just a loud discussion. I'm sorry someone called you." "It was probably that nosy bitch downstairs," Michael muttered. "Always in everyone's business." Dean ignored him, focusing on Sarah. "Are you sure you're okay? You can speak freely." Sarah glanced at her husband, then back to Dean. Something flickered in her eyes, fear, resignation, or maybe a silent plea before she forced a smile. "I'm fine. Really." Dean had seen this scene play out too many times. The script never changed. "Mrs. Conrad, if you'd like to speak privately, we can." "She said she's fine," Michael cut in. "Now, unless you're arresting someone, I think we're done here." Dean felt Wilcox tense beside him, ready to argue, but he placed a restraining hand on the younger officer's arm. "All right," Dean said finally. "But Mrs. Conrad, if you need anything, day or night, you call us. Understand?" Sarah nodded, her eyes downcast. Outside, Wilcox exploded as soon as they were back in the patrol car. "We're just leaving her there? With him? We both know what's happening." "We follow protocol," Dean repeated, his voice flat. "She's an adult. She won't press charges. She won't leave. Our hands are tied." "That's bullshit, and you know it," Wilcox snapped. "There has to be something we can do." Dean stared out the window at the apartment building. "Sometimes the system doesn't work," he said quietly. Sometimes justice finds another way. 3 more domestic calls to the Conrad's apartment followed over the next 2 weeks. Each time, the same dance, the same denials, the same inability to help. After the last call, Dean stayed late at the station, reviewing Michael Conrad's file. 3 arrests for assault before he met Sarah. All charges eventually dropped. A restraining order from a previous girlfriend. Employment records showing he'd been fired twice for interpersonal conflicts. A pattern, clear as day, and yet the system could do nothing without Sarah's cooperation. Dean was still at his desk when Captain Reynolds found him just after midnight. "Mercer, go home, get some sleep." Dean looked up from the file. "Sir, we need to do something about the Conrad situation. It's escalating." Reynolds sighed, leaning against the desk. "Look, I know this one's getting to you, especially after what happened with the Torres case." Dean stiffened. "This has nothing to do with Torres, doesn't it?" Reynolds studied him. "You crossed a line there, Dean. Nearly cost you your badge. I can't have you obsessing over another case where the victim won't cooperate." "So we just wait until she ends up dead?" Dean's voice rose. "Like Maria Torres? That's not fair. We did everything by the book with Torres. And she still died," Dean said bitterly. "The book didn't save her." Reynolds straightened. "Go home, Officer Mercer. That's an order. And stay away from the Conrad case unless you're called to the scene. I'm serious." Dean watched him walk away, anger simmering in his chest. The Torres case had haunted him for months. Another domestic situation. Another woman who wouldn't leave. Until her boyfriend finally put her in the ground. Dean had tried to intervene, bending rules, pushing boundaries. It had cost him his detective shield when the boyfriend's high-priced lawyer claimed harassment and intimidation. And in the end, Maria Torres still died. He wouldn't let that happen again. The following night, Dean drove his personal vehicle to the Parkview apartments after his shift. He parked across the street, watching the lighted window of Unit 307. Just watching. Michael Conrad left around 9 p.m., heading to the corner bar as he did most evenings. Dean waited 15 minutes, then approached the building. Sarah Conrad seemed unsurprised to find him at her door. "Officer Mercer, you're not in uniform." "I'm not here officially," Dean said. "May I come in?" Sarah hesitated, then stepped aside. The apartment was silent, save for a dripping faucet in the kitchen. "He's at O'Malley's," Sarah said, answering the unasked question. "Won't be back for hours." Dean nodded. "Sarah, we need to talk about your situation." She sank onto the couch, suddenly looking exhausted. "There's nothing to talk about." "There is. This won't stop. It will only get worse. I've seen it before." "You don't understand," Sarah whispered. "I can't just leave." "Why not? There are shelters, programs." "He'll find me." Her voice was flat, certain. "He said exactly what he'll do if I try to leave, and I believe him." Dean leaned forward. "What if he couldn't find you? What if he was gone?" Sarah's eyes snapped to his. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying there are other ways. Ways the system can't or won't provide." A long silence filled the room as understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes. Fear, doubt, and something else, hope, maybe flitted across her face. "You could lose your job," she finally said. "Your freedom." Dean thought of Maria Torres, of her funeral that he'd attended alone among a sea of grieving family members, of the boyfriend who'd walked free because of legal technicalities. "Some things are worth the risk," he said quietly. Sarah studied him, then stood abruptly. "You should go. I need to think." Dean left his Cardi's personal number scribbled on the back. "When you're ready," he said, "day or night." 3 days passed with no word from Sarah. Dean drove by the Parkview each night after his shift. The lights in 307 were always on, but he didn't approach again. On the 4th night, his phone rang at 2:17 a.m. "He's going to kill me." Sarah's voice was barely audible. "Not tonight, but soon. I can see it in his eyes." Dean sat up in bed, already reaching for his clothes. "Are you safe right now?" "He passed out drunk. But when he wakes up, I'll be there in 20 minutes." Elaine stirred beside him. Dean, what's wrong? Work, he said shortly. Go back to sleep. He dressed in the dark, his mind racing through scenarios, contingencies, risks. This wasn't just crossing a line, this was obliterating it. But he saw no other way. The park view was silent when he arrived, most windows dark. Sarah was waiting by the door to her apartment, a small bag clutched in her hands. I only packed essentials, she whispered. Where are we going? Somewhere safe, Dean assured her. Somewhere he won't find you. They drove in silence for nearly an hour, heading out of the city into the rural darkness beyond the suburbs. Dean had a cabin inherited from his grandfather, rarely used, remote, private, unknown to his colleagues. Perfect. You'll stay here, he explained, as they pulled up to the small wooden structure. Just for a few days, until I take care of things. Sarah didn't ask what that meant, didn't want to know. She simply nodded, clutching her bag tighter. No phone calls, Dean instructed. No contact with anyone. There's food in the pantry, generator out back if the power goes out. I'll come check on you tomorrow night. As he turned to leave, Sarah caught his arm. Why are you doing this? Risking everything for me? Dean thought of Maria Torres again. Of all the women, the system had failed. Because someone has to, he said simply. The next day, Dean went through his shift mechanically, his mind elsewhere. Wilcox noticed his distraction but didn't press for details. A small mercy. That night, Dean drove again to the Parkview Apartments. This time, he went straight to O'Malley's bar, where Michael Conrad was a fixture most evenings. Conrad was there, as expected, nursing a whiskey at the corner of the bar. Dean took a seat 2 stools away, ordered a beer he had no intention of drinking, and waited. An hour passed. Conrad grew progressively more intoxicated, more belligerent with the bartender. When he finally stumbled out into the parking lot, Dean followed. Mr. Conrad. Michael turned, squinting in the dim light. Recognition slowly dawned. Officer Mercer. Off duty, I hope, if you're coming from the bar. We need to talk about Sarah. Michael's face hardened. My wife is none of your business. She's gone, Michael. Somewhere you won't find her. What the hell are you talking about? Michael stepped closer, aggression replacing confusion. What did you do? I did what the law couldn't. I protected her from you. Michael lunged suddenly, grabbing Dean's shirt. You took my wife? You're dead. You hear me? Dead. Dean didn't resist, didn't defend himself. He needed the assault on a police officer to finally have something that would stick. But Michael read his stillness correctly and released him with a shove. I get it, he sneered. Trying to provoke me, get me on assaulting an officer. Not gonna work. He turned away, fishing for his keys. I'm going home, and if Sarah's not there, I'll file a missing persons report. Then kidnapping charges against you. See how that badge looks in prison. Dean watched him stagger to his car, mind racing. This wasn't going according to plan. If Michael reported Sarah missing, questions would be asked. The cabin could be discovered. Wait, Dean called. I'll take you to her. Michael paused, suspicious. Why would you do that? Because this has gone too far. I just wanted to scare you, make you think about what you're doing to her. But you're right, I could lose my job over this. Michael considered, then nodded. You drive. I'm probably over the limit. The night was moonless as Dean drove them out of the city. Not toward the cabin he wouldn't risk Sarah, but to an isolated spot he knew along the river. A place where patrol cars rarely passed. Where the hell are we going? Michael asked as the city lights receded in the rearview mirror. Sarah wanted somewhere you wouldn't find her, Dean said evenly. Somewhere isolated. They drove in silence for several more miles before Dean turned onto a dirt road that wound through dense trees toward the river. This doesn't look right, Michael said, tension creeping into his voice. Dean didn't respond, just continued driving until the road ended in a small clearing near the riverbank. He stopped the car, but left the engine running. Where is she? Michael demanded, looking around at the empty clearing. She's safe, Dean said. That's what matters. Understanding dawned in Michael's eyes. You never brought her here? This was your plan all along? Dean turned to face him. You were warned, Conrad. multiple times. You were given chances to change, to stop hurting her. So what? You're judge and executioner now? Michael's hand moved slowly toward the door handle. You're throwing away your career, your freedom. For what? Some woman you barely know? For justice, Dean said quietly. The kind the system can't provide. Michael lunged for the door, but Dean was faster, grabbing his arm. They struggled in the confines of the car. Michael's alcohol-dulled reflexes no match for Dean's trained strength. In the struggle, Dean's elbow hit the gearshift, knocking the car into neutral. The vehicle began rolling toward the riverbank, picking up speed on the gentle slope. "Stop the car!" Michael shouted, panic replacing anger. Dean could have, should have, but he didn't. The car plunged into the river with a massive splash. Water quickly began seeping through the doors as the vehicle sank. In the chaos, Michael's survival instincts took over. He stopped fighting Dean and instead focused on escaping the sinking car. Dean could have helped, should have, but he didn't. He freed himself from the submerging vehicle, swimming strongly to shore. Behind him, he heard splashing, desperate cries for help, then silence. Justice served. For 2 weeks, Dean lived with what he'd done. During the day, he performed his duties, responded to calls, filled out paperwork. At night, he barely slept. Sarah remained at the cabin, too afraid to return to her life even after news reports confirmed her husband's tragic accident, apparent drunk driving leading to a watery grave. "You can start fresh now," Dean told her during his visits. "New town, new name if you want. He can never hurt you again." But Sarah had grown distant, watching him with uncertain eyes. "What happens to you now?" she asked once. "Nothing," Dean assured her. "It was an accident. Case closed." Except it wasn't. Something had broken inside Dean Mercer that night by the river. Some line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. And in quiet moments, he wondered if justice and vengeance were really as different as he'd once believed. Then came the night of the rain, the night of the silver sedan driving erratically, the night everything unraveled. Pull over. That silver sedan. The driver's acting strange. Discovering the woman's body in the trunk should have horrified him. Instead, Dean felt a cold detachment as he arrested the driver, a man named Thomas Winters, who sobbed that it had been an accident, that he'd only meant to scare his girlfriend when she threatened to leave him. A familiar story, one that usually ended with a woman dead and a man serving minimal time, if any. But as Winters was processed and the investigation began, details emerged that shattered Dean's detachment. The woman, Jessica Lane, had been having an affair with a police officer. The evidence was on her phone. Text messages, photos of Dean Mercer. The affair had been brief. A connection formed during a routine call to Jessica's workplace months ago. It had ended weeks before her death, before Dean's focus had shifted entirely to Sarah Conrad's situation. But now, with Jessica dead and her jealous boyfriend in custody, those photos created questions. Why hadn't Officer Mercer disclosed his relationship with the victim? Why had he specifically targeted Winters' vehicle that night? Had there been a setup? Suspicion fell on Dean like a shadow. Internal Affairs opened another investigation. This time, they dug deeper, checked his movements, his phone records, found inconsistencies in his statements about the night Michael Conrad drowned. Sarah, when questioned, broke under the pressure, told them everything: Dean's offer of help, the cabin, his return alone that night, with vague explanations about her husband no longer being a problem. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. Dean Mercer, rogue officer, vigilante, murderer. As he sat in an interrogation room, the same ones where he'd questioned countless suspects over the years, Dean felt no regret, only a hollow certainty that he'd done what the system couldn't or wouldn't do. "Why, Dean?" Captain Reynolds asked, genuine pain in his eyes. "Why throw everything away like this?" Dean thought of Maria Torres, of Sarah Conrad, of all the victims the system had failed. "Because someone had to," he said simply. In the end, the case against Thomas Winters was tainted by Dean's misconduct. Evidence collected during the traffic stop was deemed inadmissible fruit of the poisonous tree. Winters walked free on a technicality, Jessica Lane's death unpunished. Michael Conrad's death was ruled a homicide, but the evidence was largely circumstantial. Dean maintained his innocence throughout the trial, claiming the drowning had been a terrible accident during a well-intentioned attempt to reunite a troubled couple. The jury deliberated for 6 days before returning a verdict of manslaughter rather than murdera small mercy, perhaps in recognition of Dean's years of service. As the bailiff led him away to begin his 12-year sentence, Dean caught sight of Sarah Conrad sitting in the back of the courtroom. Their eyes met briefly, and in hers he saw not gratitude, not relief, but fear, the same fear she'd shown in Michael's presence. Only then did Dean Mercer understand his terrible miscalculation. He had tried to deliver justice, to right the wrongs of a broken system. Instead, he had become what he despised, another man who thought violence was the answer, another man who believed the end justified the means. Another man women learned to fear. In his cell that night, Dean stared at the ceiling and thought about justice. Real justice, not the vigilante version he'd embraced. Justice built on law, on rights, on due process. Imperfect, yes. Frustrating, often. But the alternative was something much darker. He had stained the badge he'd once been so proud to wear, betrayed the oath he'd sworn to uphold, and worst of all, he'd failed the very victims he'd sought to protect. The system was broken, but Dean Mercer had not fixed it. He had only broken himself. Subscribe and like if you enjoyed the video.